Why is it that the English dissenting tradition has produced in this century so many engaged and independent-minded historians? Marjorie Reeves is one such. Descendant and chronicler of Wiltshire nonconformist, she comes of Baptist stock. She took her first degree at Oxford and her second at London, and in the 1930s she taught in teachers' training colleges in London, returning to Oxford in the Second World War, and thereafter being fellow and tutor in modern history at St Anne's College, Oxford, where generations of undergraduates encountered her enthusiasm and benefited from her readiness to take their efforts seriously, and in this way to get them to think for themselves. Marjorie Reeves's contributions to historical studies have been of two very different kinds. One has been in medieval studies, where she was a pioneer, now internationally recognized, in demonstrating the central importance of the writings of the Abbot Joachim of Fiore as a contribution to the central tradition of Christian prophecy in European thought, from the 12th century almost to the present day. This achievement has been recognized in her Fellowship of the British Academy. There are many books and articles to her name in this area. The other contribution, a more unusual one among historians, a reclusive lot on the whole, has been her humane, liberal, and incisive engagement in the debates of the last half-century on educational issues in general and on the teaching of history in particular. This achievement has been recognized very recently by the award of the Medlicott Medal from the Historical Association. Long before we had a national curriculum to sharpen and perhaps also, who knows, to narrow the focus of historical teaching in schools, Marjorie was bringing to the question her own recognition of the powerfulness of history and of myth for good and for ill. And this has contributed, I believe, to her engagement all her life with the moral dimension of the way in which history is studied and is taught. Marjorie, it's very good to have you here today. Before we come to the Abbot Joachim, can we start perhaps with your early life? You were born in Wiltshire.
Yes, I was born almost underneath the Westbury White Horse. And I grew up with surroundings which really almost made me want to be an archaeologist. When I was very young, my great idea was to excavate the barrows up on the White Horse Hill. But then I went to Trowbridge Grammar School for Girls, one of these good old grammar schools which really kind of made it possible for the young who had not got much money to get to Oxford in those days. And I had a splendid history mistress, and she really made one interpret as well as trying to analyze the nature of history. And I think what really started me on the track of being a historian was that, I suppose, when I was about the middle school, and we were doing the Civil War in the 17th century, English Civil War, and I wrote an impassioned imaginary speech which Cromwell was supposed to have delivered in the Long Parliament, you see, and that's really, I really discovered then that I was a natural roundhead. And I got what was then called in the school an excellent lesson for it. And this is, in a way, what really kind of started me off. Perhaps I should say that I suppose this linked in with my own family background, because my family, who'd been in the area for a long time, had, from the middle of the 17th century, had been Baptists. And this kind of took me into a world, really, where on the whole, you didn't believe in establishments.
Perhaps this led you later to your interest in heretics and dissenters.
Yes, indeed, I think it did.
Yes. And after Wiltshire, you came as an undergraduate to the University of Oxford. Yes.
Yes, indeed, where I was extremely happy. It was in the days, of course, when I suppose if you were a man and you didn't belong perhaps to the select group, you might have felt a bit out of it. But I do think a women's college in those days was very egalitarian. There was no kind of sense of difference between people like myself. I would call myself a little country rabbit coming up from an extremely rural background, and highly sophisticated people. I was very happy there. I had, as my tutor, general tutor, Marjorie Reeves, who of course became famous for her, Dame Marjorie Reeves later became famous for her work in Africa. But the person who really influenced me most was Dr. Cecilia Adey, known in those days, as I think still probably known to some of you anyway, certainly, as a great Renaissance scholar. Certainly. And she lived across the road from St. Hugh's, and I did the Dante special subject with her. And this really, I would say in modern parlance, turned me on.
So you became interested in the history of medieval Italy?
And very much indeed, yes.
Did you decide to embark on some research just about at that time?
Well, no, I didn't actually think about research at that time, because these were days long before state studentships. There was no money in my family for me to go on. I was passionately interested in teaching, and so after I'd done schools, I stayed on a year and did the education diploma, and then I took myself off to a girls', an old foundation school in Greenwich, again a girls' grammar school, and taught for 2 years there, trying out my hand with very unruly classes at doing all kinds of experimental history work. And then, at the end, about the middle of my second year, two things happened. One was that my principal from St. Hugh's, Miss Guire, wrote me a typically laconic little note saying, "You ought to apply for this." And this was a very small studentship at Westfield for research. And at the same time, Miss Adey was advising me about what I should do on that. So I made one. I won the scholarship from Westfield. Went there. I made one false shot in starting out on a project on Lombard communes, which had interested me when I was doing Italian history in the undergraduate course. But that didn't work. I found I was bored with this.
And how did you find the Abbot?
Well, it was entirely by accident, really. I was looking around and I read an essay by a French historian, Émile Gebhardt, on Italy in the Middle Ages. And in this there was a very good, looking back, I regard it as a really very seminal essay on Joachim Fiore, about whom people knew really in those days very little, or didn't take him very seriously. The only historian previously to only two historians who had taken him seriously was Ernest Renan, the Frenchman, and Denis, writing in German. But this essay was really, really inspired my imagination, I think partly because here was a man who, though he remained a very devout member of the Latin Church, living in the 12th century, nonetheless really was quite radical in the implications of some of his views, and particularly the notion that there was a third age of the spirit which was coming, in which there would be all the institutions of the present age would be revolutionized, you see. So this is how I started.
And where did you find the material initially?
Well, this was a problem. The Westfield people were, in the first place, were really rather annoyed with me for wanting to change from a nice conventional subject, the Lombard communes. And I may say various other people said to me, this is a great mistake for your career. You ought to be doing something conventional like investigating the wardrobe under Edward II, which was one of the topics in those days, which was very much on the cards. So they had a great difficulty in finding me a supervisor. But in the end, they found I got a famous Italian scholar, Ernest Gardner, and
at University College.
At University College.
Yeah.
But before that, I had taken myself off to the British Museum to find out who had been writing about Joachim Fiore. And the first thing that struck me was that in the beginning, in the first 2 decades of the 16th century, a group of Venetian Augustinian friars had edited and published the main works of this abbot. Now, in those days, one's idea of the Renaissance was that, on the whole, there was almost a kind of cut between the Middle Ages and the 15th, 16th century. Now, that I know that view has changed. But I said to myself, why in the world were these Augustinian hermits interested in a 12th century? He was Benedictine and then Cistercian later. So my first project was to find out why they had started publishing these works, and that led me into all kinds of ways. So I used to work in the British Museum all day. It was a great, I suppose I should call it the British Library, but I'm awfully wedded to the old, and the great round reading room with all its strange, eccentric readers. I had a friend, a research student along with me, who did wonderful little sketches, pencil sketches of all these strange people. And then in the evenings I would go along to Edmund Gardner in University College to report what I had been finding.
And you finished this initial piece of research quite early, in the late 1920s, did you?
Well, I started in 29, having had my 2 years teaching, and I finished it in 32, 33. By that time, I had got a post as a lecturer in history in what was then called a teacher training college down in southeast London at Camberwell.
St Gabriel's.
That's right,
Yes.
St Gabriel's, just
Yes.
Rather south, between the Oval, between Kennington Oval and Camberwell Green, this sort of area.
And was this the occasion on which your interest in the teaching of history and the different problems in the teaching of history to different age groups among school children developed?
Yes, yes, very much so. At least it really started in my 2 years teaching, when I think I was rather chaotic in my class management, but we did some rather amusing things in the way of sort of investigatory work, project work. And so when I got to St Gabriel's, I was encouraged by a very innovative principal to do a good deal of work in schools. Oh dear, we used to trek round by tram and bus to all these schools behind the Elephant and Castle and all around that sort of area.
This was a tough time.
It was a very tough
1930s.
time. They were most of them were terrible schools in very old buildings, but there were some absolutely marvellous teachers.
And in fact, you're actively involved in some of the
Well, I
current-
am. I'm involved in this project at the British Library, the Education Department of the British Library, on preparing material on video, audio-video material for use in the national curriculum in the medieval period, you see. But what
This
makes
is a CD-ROM resource where the children can
Yes, indeed.
search for themselves.
Yes,
for-
yes. You prepare a whole list of headings and cross-headings and so on. And then if they kind of learn to press the right buttons, this is how I understand it. I don't really know the technology of it. They can really find the document or the picture which they want, and as it were, do their own research.
So the merit of this is not only the information they can find, but that they get a habit early of following lines of inquiry of their own. Yes.
And of course, what makes me so cross about the debate at the moment is that the assumption is that if you pursue that method, they don't learn how to read, how to write and spell and make grammatical sentences.
Because
now,
they
this
do.
is nonsense. I mean, I think the depression then was far
More
worse,
obvious, perhaps.
more obvious
Yeah.
than the recession now.
So did you get back to the late medieval prophecy before the Second World War broke out?
Well,
or-
yes, yes and no. It was in the back of my mind all through this period, although my mind was really basically concerned with the education of children. But nonetheless, the 30s was a period when obviously something dreadful was about to happen to history. And more one felt that the study of history, that the kind of expectations and fears which people had in the past were very relevant to one's own experience in that age. It was a period when those of us who were at all politically minded, and I was pretty left-wing in those days, though I never became a Marxist, nonetheless, we were frantically trying to find to see where panaceas or where remedies lay. It was, it was a period when one was thinking furiously about these things. So in a sense, prophecy and Joachim were very connected with my own political life at that time.
Yes.
But I didn't get back to any basic research until I came back to Oxford.
Yes, and when was that?
That was in 1938. I remember sitting in the camera writing my first lectures for a large horde of pass-mod students on outlines of English constitutional history. I was writing them just when Munich was happening and thinking, shall I ever give these lectures, you see?
Yeah.
So then, of course, but during the war, I was not called up to do any outside work. The obvious policy was to keep a certain number of people in Oxford. So I was really involved in a certain amount of war work, but remained in Oxford lecturing to such people as turned up. And of course the women's colleges kept going all the way through.
And of course some of the people who turned up, most interestingly, were scholarly refugees from Nazi Germany.
Very much so, yes, very much so. And this, as I have told you before, is how in a sense I started on, or partly how I started on, my next phase of work as a historian. In a sense, it was almost like a kind of voice coming out of the out of the past, or out of another world, I should say. Not when it was about 1942. I can't put an exact date on it, I'm afraid. I got an article sent me by Professor Nikolai Rubinstein, one of these refugees who's spoken about, saying, I think this would interest you. Now, this took me back to another refugee, Otto Pecht, who was then in Oxford, an art historian, basically, who was working through all the Oxford manuscripts, that were, medieval manuscripts that were illuminated. And he'd come across a manuscript which belongs to Corpus Christi College, but which was then deposited in Bodley, which had a very interesting and rather unique set of pictures in it. He decided that these had some connection with Joachim of Fiore. He passed this information on to Dr. Saxel, yes, who was already at the Warburg, I think, which was already in London, wasn't it? And it was Saxel who wrote the article that Nikolai Rubinstein sent to me. So I owe this clue to 3 different refugee scholars. When I got the article, I rushed down to Bodley, got out the manuscript, and then remembered that a Franciscan Friar Salimbeni had mentioned in his chronicle, he was a great admirer, rather a follower of Joachim, someone one might call a Joachite, and he had 3 times over mentioned what he called Joachim's Liber Figurarum, Book of Figures. So I went and got Salimbeni's chronicle off the open shelves, found the references, and in about 5 minutes, as short a time as that, I could match them up with the pictures, and they were exact. It was an exact fit.
So that was one of those extraordinary coincidences which seem to crop up in the history of scholarship, where some clue leads you at the right moment to something really significant.
Well, this has happened to me all the way through, and I'm enormously grateful to what I might call the scholarly fellowship. For the way in which I have profited by these clues. When I was discussing this only the other day with Sir Richard Southern, he said, well, you know, it's a case that in the field of history, in the world of historical scholarship, all sorts of people give you nudges. I think they're very interesting, very unique, these figures. So there and then, I started thinking about edition of these figures. And then another refugee scholar comes into the picture because Dr. Beatrice Hirsch-Reich, a Jewish refugee from, I think, Vienna, was also into this. She came and looked over my shoulder as I was examining in Duke Humphrey in the Bodleian Library, and said, what are you doing? And then all of us, we decided to do an edition together.
Yes, and this was very well received in the scholarly world because, in a sense, the novelty of these figures which spelled out the pattern of his prophecies was quite considerable, wasn't it?
Yes, but
very few late medieval figures did this.
No, I think the uniqueness of them lies in the combination of a very strong visual imagination. And in Joachim's writing, she says, this kind of idea about history or about theology, about the Trinity, is better expressed in a picture, in a figure, he would call it, a figura, than in words. And the uniqueness of these pictures lies in this combination of of a visual imagination with a very clear intellectual discipline, which made him use geometrical forms for the pictures. But I have to say that this, I think, in this country, didn't make the impact it ought to have made. But in Italy it did.
Yeah. And shortly after this, on the track of these things, you went to Italy yourself.
Yes.
And to Calabria, to Fiore.
Yes, that was in 1950. And then in 1950, as you said, I went to Italy for my first trip, really taking a great trawl all around Italian libraries, and there seemed to be Joachim's manuscripts almost everywhere, including, of course, I spent some time in the Vatican. And as you say, I went to Calabria, where in those days there were not many tourists. The superintendent of museums and galleries took me, or arranged for me, to go up to San Giovanni in Fiore, which is where Joachim built his monastery when he retired up into the mountains. And I saw various other things there. That was a rather disappointing visit, because at that point the local commune wasn't really interested in Joachim, and the abbey was in ruins. And I had a feeling that the people there were more interested in the Marxist experiments in cooperative farming than they were in their relics. Now that has all changed. Now Joachim is a great prophet in Calabria, hailed by everybody. Well, in the event, it took me a good long time to get this together, but in the event when I published my main book, called The Influence of Prophecy in the Later Middle Ages, it took up quite a number of these different themes.
So what had become clear then was that the episode where the Augustinian friars in Venice at the beginning of the 16th century were interested in the works of Joachim, that they were not all that unusual after all, and that there were many people all over Italy who'd preserved his manuscripts and transmitted his ideas, and that you'd in fact uncovered really a whole aspect of the transmission of prophetic ideas in the later Middle Ages, which had perhaps until this time not been seen to be quite so central. You found them among the Dominicans, the Franciscans,
and even Jesuits. This is very hard to believe, but at least one Jesuit thought that in Joachim's age of the Holy Spirit, he prophesies that there will be a new order of spiritual men who will lead the church into this new life, this radical new life. And really, the words in which he prophesies this new order, he calls it one point a society designated in the name of Jesus. Really, it was almost looked like a prophetic scoop. So at least one Jesuit, Daniel Packerbrock, man who edited the volume in the Acta Sanctorum, in which he puts Joachim, you see, he really believed that Joachim had prophesied the coming of the Jesuit order. And he represents a very interesting trend in these Renaissance people. Well, he's post-Renaissance, of course, but at any rate, in the post-medieval people, he illustrates very well this trend that they were applying methods of humanist scholarship, because he dismisses the more unlikely legends. At the same time, they really still had a very medieval outlook on the nature of history, and how it would be fulfilled, and in particular, the end product of Joachim's prophecies was this vision of world unity, which would be headed up by an angelic pope and a last world emperor, and this is very widespread.
And this raises, of course, one interesting aspect, which is the political attractiveness of a good many of these prophecies, perhaps to interested parties in the 15th and early 16th century.
Yes.
So did you come to the conclusion that powerful people were interested in dealing with these prophecies for their own purposes.
Oh yes, this is a fascinating thing about the Renaissance aspect of this. And I kept being pushed later and later in following, because Joachim kept propping up in these later centuries. And in the, as you know, I've just published a set of essays, which I wrote a couple, called Prophetic Rome in the High Renaissance Period. And the fascinating thing there is that your high ecclesiastics, cardinals and heads of religious orders and so on, and people very much in with the series of Renaissance popes, Julius II, Leo X, Clement VII, they were highly sophisticated humanists in many aspects, in their oratory, for instance, their rhetoric, in their use of classical sources and all this. But at the same time, they retained or they seemed to retain so much this medieval perspective on the near future, which would be this visionary, or part of it is a visionary age, part of it, of course, concerns jubilation. But the question one asks oneself all the time is, did they really believe this? Were they, because their actions were often so, both in diplomacy, well, as you know very well, because you're into this field very much, but both in diplomacy and in military expeditions. Think of how Italy is torn into pieces in the early 16th century struggles.
Was it at this stage that Egidio Viterbo crops up?
Yes. Now Egidio was a brilliant humanist scholar, a classical scholar. He always called himself a disciple of Marsilio Ficino, who the great man in the Florentine Platonic Academy. But as a cardinal, he was very much patronized by Julius II. Well, all the three popes I've mentioned. He advises them and is very powerful influence. But he writes a history. He calls it the history of 20 centuries. They're not centuries; they're periods of time, really. 10 before the Incarnation, 10 in the Christian era. He writes a history which has really nothing to, or very little to do with what we would call modern history in trying to discover what actually happened in events. It is much more tracking down the signs of prophecy.
So it's a providential plan.
It's a providential plan right through.
Is it an element in the perpetual renewal of these prophecies that they were so flexible, they could be reinterpreted in so many ways?
Yes, indeed, this is the thing. And indeed, the prophecies I'm talking about now are really developments of Joachim's ideas. But after all, this idea, this vision of a possible new age which is going to be better, or possibly even nearing perfection, is something that is a thread that runs right through the history of men's expectations, and we still have it today, even though we happen to be in rather a trough of gloom at the moment. But there have been plenty of representatives of this idea.
And how did it come about that you found that these ideas had a renewed appeal to the Romantics in the 19th century?
In the 19th century. Well, yes, that was really very strange. I had really thought I'd almost finished with Joachim when I had got to the end of the 16th century, because after that, except for the mid-17th century people in England, where there are some interesting traces, but after the end of the 17th century, it seemed to me that the whole interest in apocalyptic, in visions of the future and so on, really dies down. And then, actually, it was at a British Academy dinner, I think, that I met Professor Norman Cohn, whom I know very well, and who, of course, wrote this very seminal book called The Pursuit of the Millennium, quite a long time back. And he said to me, did you know that Georges Sand, in the middle 19th century, wrote a story about Joachim? I said, good gracious, no, why in the world is this? And this started me off on something which turned into a book which I did with a collaborator, called the myth, Joachim of Fiore, the myth of the eternal evangel in the 19th century. My collaborator is Warwick Gould from it's now Royal Holloway and Bedford College, isn't it? And he is a great Yeats expert, and the reason why I fetched him in the first place was that I couldn't cope with the chapter on Yeats, because Yeats also wrote a story about Joachim. But what this turned into was a book about a whole range of people, all of whom, in very different ways, of course, but including in a certain sense George Eliot and even possibly D.H. Lawrence in England, and a number of people in France, Pierre Leroux, a Republican, and Mazzini in Italy, and then I'll mention my Czech find in a moment. But what characterized all these people was their sense that, though they were all on the radical side, they'd broken with establishments, both, in some cases, both political and religious, certainly with religious establishments, but they were all religious people in the sense that they believed there ought to be, in the new religion of humanity in the future, some element from the past. Their future, they felt their future had to be, as it were, confirmed out of the past. Mm-hmm. History was very important to them in building up their notion of this vision of the future. And actually, I should have said, their initial inspiration in finding out, in getting hold of this, comes from Lessing, who unearthed, for some reason, I think I've got the link, I think I can get the link through, but he unearthed some of Joachim's more radical and certainly heretical followers in the 13th century, who had proclaimed this idea of the eternal evangel, which is a new gospel for the future.
Yes, so the eternal evangel could be a very seditious notion in certain hands. Yes. It could mean the dissolution of ecclesiastical institutions. And
yes, oh, exactly. This is the thing. And this is what, I think it's this image. It comes, of course, originally from the Apocalypse, from the book of Revelation, where one of the angels flies through the heavens, having in his hand the eternal evangel. I think this, Jung fastened onto this, and he said this notion of the eternal evangel, these heretics of the 13th century who pursued this, is a very archetypal image which will crop up again and again and again.
So your interest, in fact, has been first in the content of the Abbot Joachim's thought for its own intrinsic interest, but really also, and perhaps to a greater extent, in the extraordinary things that people in various countries at various times have done with these ideas, and how fertile they've proved for a variety of different purposes, which is a historical curiosity in itself.
Well, yes, it is a curiosity. But before we move on to that point, I think I really, because it's so topical today, I think I must really mention my, again, an extraordinary little nudge which I got, which took me most unexpectedly to a Czechoslovakian source. I went to Prague on a musical tour for the festival there, and the leader of this tour was of this group is a specialist in Janacek's music. So when he heard that my subject research was the Abbot Joachim, he said, you can write me a footnote, because I'm doing a life and an analysis of Janacek's music. And he wrote a cantata based on a poem, or rather it actually uses the whole text. The text of a poem which a Czech poet wrote in 1895, in the period when Czech culture, Bohemian culture, was just reviving. And this poem is a poem about Joachim and the eternal evangel. I got a translation of the poem. It's rather a fine one, even in English translation, and it pictures Joachim sitting on a mountain at the top of the Sila Mountains in Calabria, and the earth is dark below him, and all the peoples are moaning and groaning. And the angel of the eternal evangel flies through the heavens, flashes through the heavens with the evangel. And then the angel proclaims the great new age to come.
And this was made into a cantata.
And this was made into a cantata by Janacek, who gave, let me think, a tenor part to the angel, and I think a baritone part to Joachim, and then a chorus of people who take up the whole message of the age of the Spirit, and who sing about liberty and love and illumination, you see. But if I could come back to your point about the power of history, really. This is what we were really getting on to almost, wasn't it?
Well, the power of these ideas to appeal to all kinds of people in different circumstances.
Yes, and
what is it about them, do you think, that has made them so recurrent?
Well, I think because there is a basic there's a basic doctrine of optimism about, I mean, whatever tribulations are going to come. And I may say, Joachim, of course, in his medieval frame of thought, never underrated Antichrist or the tribulations, but essentially history was going to reach a climax, in which there was a fulfillment in time and space. The fulfillment was not, as it were, postponed to eternity.
And the fulfillment was not a cataclysm.
No, fulfillment
not disaster. Was a renewal.
Was an apotheosis of history in which all the potentialities of men and women would reach a higher level. Indeed, when Yeats wrote his story, he portrayed the age as an age of artists. Though he was a bit ambivalent about it because he saw it also as very anarchical and wasn't really quite sure where, in the end, the story ends up as if he's frightened of it.
And what are your current plans?
Well, I've got one or two sort of, what shall I say, some kind of jobs to finish up on Joachimism. But I think really what I'm very much concerned with this British Library project, but more widely than that, at the moment I really am wanting to involve myself more in the general educational scene, coming back to almost to my experience that, though I realize I'm terribly out of date on this now. Not that the books that I wrote, the Then and There series of history books, which I wrote for schools, is any longer used very much. Because
they must have influenced 2 generations.
Well, yes, I believe it did. I mean, there was a stage when people said, well, you find the Then and There books in all the
What
schools.
was the aim of that formula?
The aim was was to take children, the young, I should say, because they were really focused mainly on the 12, 13-year-olds, but more widely a bit either end. And the aim was to get away from these dehydrated general statements, which sometimes you can learn off without really kind of understanding or using any imagination on, to get away from that and to take the young into specific patches of history, very specific. Each book, there were more than 100 in the series by the time I'd finished, was on, well, most of them, almost all of them, were on quite a narrow topic, like the medieval village or the Elizabethan country house, in which you tried to recreate, as close to the sources as possible, a specific piece of life, a section of life, which was then, it was in a specific date and a particular time, then and there, you see.
So the concrete and the particular was a means to raise inquiry in their minds.
And then the idea was to use these in conjunction with outlines in which you could, as it were, thick beads that you strung on perhaps a rather thin string, do you see? And I do think it works. I think it works in 2 ways. One is that you give the young a chance to enter into what for you and me, I'm sure, is the for both of us, is the one of the great attractions of history, which is history as an intellectual puzzle. You have your sources and you really try to work out the various puzzles. And I think it's possible for children to, at their own level, to do something of this sort of thing. And so you get a great sort of intellectual kind of stimulus that kind of way. And that's the kind of external objective side of it. But I also think that the whole meaning of history in our civilization, very widely for everybody, is to various ways to enter into some kind of an imaginative experience of it. Because as I've been trying to say about all these ideas of the Abbot Joachim, we seem to need the ideas of the past to, as it were, fuel our understanding of our own place in the present.
So that encountering something quite alien and exotic, encountering an other, as it were, is perhaps one of the roots of tolerance?
It is indeed, and as I think you were reminding me when we were talking before, at the moment, what else so much is needed? It's terribly badly needed, because history, of course, can also be a terrible thing. It can become a whole set of prejudices that lock you into a kind of past that makes you incapable of understanding anything different from yourself, anything outside your culture, anything outside your religion, and produces, of course, I don't need to
topical events
to mention the terrible topical events, which all have such an awful historical legacy behind them. And it seems to be the only way to counter that is to develop dialogue with history. Really, that's what it comes to. That may sound an awfully inexact way to speak about historical scholarship, but I think, in fact, true dialogue, though there is a subjective element, and though I think all historians have a subjective element.
Of course, many people will have encountered you personally, as distinct from your work, or as well as your work. They'll have encountered you in your tutor's capacity in the University of Oxford over many years. And can you tell us really what you think happens in a tutorial, or perhaps sometimes happens?
Well, of course, the Oxford tutorial is a marvellous system, because you start by hearing what a student has done with a bit of investigation on his or her own before you give any pronouncements at all. And this to me is, of course, one always has one's boring times when you sort of, anyway, but at its best, this can be a very exhilarating experience, because you're watching a young mind, and it's the same in a way with children, wrestling with material that you've wrestled with yourself. You're very keen to see what's going to come out of it. Quite often what comes out of it is something different from what you would have said if you were making a kind of magisterial pronouncement. And so to me, the essence of the whole thing always was, again, a real dialogue in which, if a student was really taking quite a different line from your own line, provided he or she really worked hard at building up a good case, this was absolutely splendid. And the last thing one wanted to do was to be magisterial. So this is, of course, something that something that I've applied. If you teach in America, if you teach, for instance, in Berkeley, this goes down beautifully. Every other minute, even when you're lecturing in a rather magisterial fashion, you'll have people putting up their hands and saying, please, you so and so. But if you go to Hong Kong, it's quite different, and you try to use this method. The Chinese tradition of teaching, of course, is very magisterial, and you find that they are really horrified if your students contradict you.
Yes,
or,
well,
shall I say disagree? Perhaps contradicts a bit too.
Yes, but deference is perhaps not something that you want to encounter very much.
No, I mean, I think there. I hope that there can be a natural deference when it really kind of penetrates the mind of the young. Not me, but that some of the great historians are great, and indeed I've seen this kind of thing. But I think the essence of the teaching method is certainly, on the whole, though there is a place, of course, for the grand lecture. Yes, of course there is. But in the kind of, what shall I say, the really kind of seminal stages, when students are finding their way through the stuff, I think it has to be very much non-magisterial.